there's the Countess of Ross. And, that's John Jacob Astor, the richest man on the ship. His little wifey there, Madeleine, is my age and in a delicate condition. See how she's trying to hide it? Quite the scandal.
Quite the scandal indeed. Thank you, Rose, with your big mouth. Rose was right. This was a scandal. Even though we know that there are weirdos who will say things like, "That was way back in the day. Times were different. It was normal for grown men to be in love with teenagers, blah, blah, blah." It wasn't normal for John Jacob Astor's time, and it certainly was a scandal that he had an 18-year-old wife. The scandal was only compounded by the fact that he had rather recently been divorced from his wife of nearly 20 years who had bore him 2 children, and she was with the in crowd of New York's high society. So this union between John Jacob Astor and Madeleine, the new, younger Mrs. Astor, was definitely giving the people something to talk about in 1912, and it's giving us something to talk about today. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload one of these videos or every time that I live stream. And hit that like button to support this video. Thank you. Now, on to why you are here. Nosy Rosie told us that John Jacob Astor was the richest man on the Titanic and that his wife was pregnant. She was telling the truth. John Jacob Astor was born into wealth in 1864. He was a Harvard-educated man who started managing his family's fortune in 1891, 2 years before his second wife was even born. The same year, he married his first wife, Ava. They did the thing that rich society couples do and had a very expensive wedding at her parents' mansion in Philadelphia. Then they went on a several weeks-long honeymoon that started in the Poconos and ended on a 5-week trip to Europe. That kind of sounds like the kind of honeymoon that he also had with his second wife who was on the Titanic with him. But, nevertheless, John Jacob Astor and Ava had 2 children, a boy named Vincent and a girl named Ava, after her mother. In 1897, John Jacob Astor built the Astoria Hotel. Today, we know the entire hotel complex as the Waldorf Astoria. But before Astor built the Astoria, his cousin and rival, William Waldorf Astor, had already built the Waldorf Hotel in 1893, 4 years before Astor's Astoria. I'll have to put the rich people rivalry aside for now, but the Waldorf Astoria does play a role in the sinking of the Titanic. I'll get to that in a moment. Years later, after his hotel was built, Astor's marriage started falling apart, and it seems that he was the one to blame. This 1909 edition of the Pensacola News-Journal reported on the beginning of the end. Mrs. Astor had returned home from a trip to Europe. Mr. Astor made it his business to be gone 3 days before she arrived. Grounds for divorce? Adultery, with the woman who became his second wife, the teen on the Titanic. This was seen as a huge failure for John Jacob Astor. Divorce is taken pretty casually these days, but in his time, especially for a man of his stature, divorce was a thing of shame. The Astors' relatives, friends, and high society club members were shocked and looking down on John Astor for ruining his family and bringing shame upon their name. Their son, William Vincent, was 17 at the time. Their daughter, Ava Alice, was only 7. Families like this were typically afforded the luxury of keeping their private lives private, only appearing in the newspapers to show off the best sides of their lives, graduations, weddings, business accomplishments, etc. But this story was just too juicy to not discuss, and just like that, the Astors' private lives became public fodder for the news media. Decades before paparazzi photographers were a known thing, here is Ava Astor in a 1909 photo taken by a Buffalo newspaper photographer. The headline brags that she couldn't escape the photographers. John Astor was looked at as an old fool for chasing an 18-year-old. She was just a year older than his son. Astor was 47. But Madeleine's mother was going to be sure that her daughter's destiny was to be more than a rich old man's plaything. She would see to it that the Colonel Astor would make an honest woman out of her daughter. Well, it was bad enough when he was cheating with Madeleine, but when he married her, his friends and family were infuriated. And that marriage caused Astor to be ostracized from high society, even though he was the richest man in the country, having a net worth of at least $87 million. Some sources claim almost double that. Either way, his net worth would be valued at more than $2 billion today. To give a picture of just how bad it got, check out this Lincoln Star article that was printed just months before the Titanic sank. It shows that the stain of this union with this teenage bride affected more people than his wife and his kids, and even caused one of his cousins to lose his job. Part of the story reads, quote, "The scandal over the marriage of John Jacob Astor and Madeleine IV caused the present poverty-stricken condition of the Charles Frederick Astors. Charles Frederick, before the wedding, had a good position painting a house for a widow on 91st Street. One day, when the discussion over the wedding was at its height, the widow asked him if he was any relation of John Jacob. Charles Frederick admitted it, and just for that, he was fired the next day." End quote. Poor Charles. All of that is bad enough. But he was supporting his wife and 22-year-old son, who had been working, but couldn't work at that time because his wooden leg had worn out. And here is evidence that the high society people were not a fan of Astor's new bride. There was a very exclusive group called the 400 that was started in the 1880s by Caroline Astor, John Jacob's mother. These were the upper crust of Manhattan. And in January of 1912, John Jacob Astor and his new bride were scheduled to throw a ball for the 400. But as you can see from this paper, he canceled the party because his wife had been snubbed by the high society crowd. Hoping that if he got out of town for long enough, that the people would stop hating his wife and thinking that he was a jackass, John Jacob took his wife on a long honeymoon. They went to Europe and Egypt for several weeks. And when it was said that the biggest, most luxurious ship that had ever been made was taking its maiden voyage to New York, it only made sense that J.J. Astor would book a trip on it for himself, his wife, and their unborn child. And the fact that this ship was unsinkable was a major plus. Well, as we know, the Titanic was not unsinkable. After it hit the iceberg on April 14th at 11:40 p.m., John did everything in his power to tend to his wife. He saw to it that Madeleine, her maid, and her nurse made it into a lifeboat. He hired a nurse to travel with them because of her pregnancy. She was 5 months at the time that the Titanic went down. Astor was told that he could not accompany his wife in the lifeboat, so he walked away after seeing that Madeleine and her staff were secure. By the following evening, newspapers all over the globe had headlines about the Titanic sinking. And as with any big news story, when it was first reported, a lot of the details were wrong. Like this April 15th edition of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which reported that John Astor was among the notable passengers who was taken off of the Titanic and were alive. His wife is also listed here, and it is true that she was taken off. But there are a number of names on this page who, like John Jacob Astor, were not taken off of the ship and died that night or very early morning. Ironically, the Titanic was not the only boat that J.J. Astor had been on that triggered news reports questioning his safety. Shortly after his divorce, Astor and his son were on his yacht while on a visit to Puerto Rico, and he was thought to have been lost in a hurricane. After he was found alive, papers reported that his ex-wife was relieved to learn that her son was unharmed. But back to April 1912. Eventually, by the next day or two, the correct word got out that J.J. Astor was among those who were dead. I do think that part of the reason that so many papers were reporting the men in first class were alive when they were actually dead was that there was an assumption that first-class passengers would be saved first because of their money and status, and for the most part, that was true. That was and is the way of the world, and one cannot help but notice that the newspapers gave the same preferential coverage to the rich and famous. But here are the names of Joseph Laroche and his family. He was the only man of Haitian descent on the Titanic, a biracial man who is too often called the only black man on the Titanic. I published a video about him that I will link in the description box, in case you haven't already seen it. The sinking of the Titanic resulted in 2 inquiries, one by the British Wreck Commissioner in London, the other by the United States Senate that was held in New York City, at the Waldorf Astoria. I told you that, come back to it. It does seem a little ironic, maybe even eerie, that a hotel built by one of the most talked about passengers on the Titanic ends up being the place where his death is discussed. His death along with so many others, of course. One passenger testified that he saw John Jacob Astor clinging to a raft with English journalist William Stead. Stead is considered to be the father of investigative journalism. He died along with Astor and over 1,500 other people in the wee hours of April 15, 1912. Astor's body was recovered. Most were not. He is buried at the Trinity Churchyard in Manhattan. His widow gave birth to their son, August 14, 1912. J.J. Astor left his son a $3 million trust and Madeleine an outright sum of $100,000. As long as she didn't remarry, she was also entitled to the income from a $5 million trust fund and use of his house on Fifth Avenue. But she did remarry, more than once, and one of those marriages was awful and embarrassing for her. Madeleine Astor was the widow of the wealthiest man on the Titanic who went down with the ship on her maiden voyage, John Jacob Astor. She was merely a teenager, 18, and just 1 year older than his son when she started dating the 40-something John Jacob, which caused his first wife of almost 20 years to divorce him. Madeleine ended her romance in first class with her first husband, millionaire John Jacob Astor, and she started her romance on another ocean liner, inviting a guy from second class to dine with her. He would become her third husband, Italian boxer Enzo Fiermonte. She was on the prowl for an Italian stallion, and he wanted some of that Astor fortune. Was he her karma, plus some extra? Let's get into it. When the Titanic hit the iceberg on April 14, 1912 at 11:40 p.m. ship's time, she sank less than 3 hours later, in the early morning hours of April 15th, and all of the ladies in first class, except for 5, survived. Madeleine Astor was one of those ladies who survived, thanks in part to her husband, who saw to it that she got into a lifeboat. John Jacob Astor took care of Madeleine in the physical sense on his last day on Earth, and he had taken care of her and their unborn child in the financial sense months before they ever left the country for their extended vacation. For his unborn son, he had left a $3 million trust. For his wife, Madeleine, he left an outright sum of $100,000, which, adjusted for inflation, is worth a little more than $3 million today in 2023. Now, that $100,000 she got no matter what, but John threw in a couple of extras for her on the condition that she never remarried: the use of his Fifth Avenue mansion and the income from a $5 million trust. Sounds like a nice deal. So of course she collected her inheritance and lived happily ever after, right? Of course not. If she had, I certainly wouldn't be telling that boring story here. We need the hot mess, and boy oh boy did she ever land in one. Madeleine would marry 2 more times after the death of John Jacob Astor. The first time was to wealthy banker William Carl Dick. He had actually been a childhood friend to Madeleine. He didn't have Astor money, but he was the vice president of a trust company and part owner of the Brooklyn Times newspaper. So Losing her stipend from the Astor $5 million trust didn't exactly cause her any financial stress. They had 2 boys together and eventually divorced. The standard stuff of which divorces are made, no real hot mess there. But that second time that she married after John Jacob Astor died, wow. If anyone held a grudge against her and considered her to be a young little bluesy of a gold-digging homewrecker for being Astor's mistress while he was married to his first wife, Ava, well, they probably got a little bit of joy from seeing how the tables turned on Madeleine with this third husband. When John Jacob Astor met Madeleine in 1909, he was deeply infatuated by a young girl who wanted to be with him. He had lust in his eyes, and she likely had dollar signs in her eyes. Fast forward to 1932, aboard the Vulcania ocean liner, and now Madeleine, at the age of 39, and according to numerous sources, fading quickly in the looks department, sat across a dinner table from Enzo Fiermonte, with lust in her eyes. He was only 24. He was Italian, and there had long been sexual stereotypes about Italian men that made them out to be good lovers. And he was a prize fighter, a boxer. So, because of his profession, he was known to have a great physique and thought to be well-conditioned. So you can imagine all of the thoughts that her dirty little mind was conjuring up. By the way, she was not quite divorced from William Carl Dick yet. Just like Astor wasn't divorced when he started fooling around with Madeleine, so many parallels. As for Enzo Fiermonte, his intentions were not pure with her either. But while she wanted sex from him, he wanted money from her. Yes, he was a prize fighter, but he wasn't a very good one. And he wasn't very different from a lot of 24-year-old men at any point in history. He wanted expensive clothes and watches, and fast cars and women. So they sat across from each other at the dinner table, staring at each other and fantasizing. Madeleine staring at his handsome face and how well his frame filled out his suit, and wondering what was going on underneath it. Enzo staring at her diamond rings and pearl necklace, wondering how much a pawn shop would pay him for the jewelry. It was Madeleine's doctor who, yes, traveled with her because after Titanic, traveling made her a ball of nerves, as you can imagine. Anyway, it was her doctor who thought that it would be a keen idea to invite Enzo from second class to join Madeleine for dinner in first class. And it would be her doctor who convinced Enzo to see Madeleine for the second time. See, after Enzo had dinner with her that first night, he vowed to himself to never see her again because he had a wife back home in Italy, a wife and a son. But that guilt didn't last long. Like literally the next day, Enzo went up to the first class deck to see Madeleine again. Her doctor had convinced Enzo that some of Madeleine's rich friends might be of benefit to him in his boxing career. And let's just say the doctor didn't have to tell Enzo twice. He spent the whole day with Madeleine, playing deck tennis and backgammon and eating and drinking. They were on a date that lasted all day. It was as if Tosca and Gianni didn't exist. You don't know who they are? Yeah, neither did Enzo at the time. Tosca was his wife and Gianni was his baby boy. That vow that he had made to himself when he went to sleep that night after he met Madeleine was broken as soon as he woke up the very next morning. And after spending that glorious day of fun with Madeleine, he told her that she was beautiful when she smiled. And he did make that distinction. He said that when she smiled, she looked pretty and young, but that normally she looked old and frumpy. He kept the old and frumpy part to himself that night. That would come out later when he started flapping his gums to the press. But that night, she was beautiful. She told him that she thought that he was trying to flatter her because she knew that she didn't look as attractive as she used to when she was younger. Well, he told her he meant it, and he kissed her on their second night together. It was after dinner, and they were out on the deck, under the moonlight. Enzo said that they were in, quote, a misty romantic heaven, end quote. Then he left the fantasy world of first class with his rich girlfriend and her fancy, wealthy friends, and retired to his second-class reality, and the guilt set in once again. He started thinking about his wife and son back home in Italy. Before the cruise was over, he confessed to Madeleine that he had a wife, and that he needed to stop seeing Madeleine. Well, Madeleine, still married herself, said, damn that, okay? She said that she was not giving up that hard penny. She was very persistent about continuing her relationship with Enzo. So much so that when their ship docked in Naples, before he disembarked to go off to see his wife and kid, she told him to join her at the Lido in Venice. Well, from Naples, Enzo went home to reunite with his wife and son, where he did not tell his wife about his affair with the American woman on the Vulcania cruise ship. He barely had enough time to unpack his luggage when he received a telegram from Madeleine that read, quote, darling, come and see me. If not, I am going to Rome, end quote. In response, Signore Fiermonte hopped his behind on a train to Venice, and upon arriving there, booked a room at the Excelsior on the Lido. And shortly thereafter, his American woman met him there, and they got down to business. And I don't mean the kind of business that requires spreadsheets, but spread legs instead. You know what I mean? Now, I won't go into great detail about that night that they shared in Venice because I need to keep my YouTube channel, but Enzo went into great detail about it, sharing with one publication how great it was, but still harping on her age. Clearly, the age difference was a big deal for him, and I get it. He was only 24 and she was 39. But here's what he said, in part, quote, she was different. Everything about her was subtly changed from the woman I had met on the ship. It was as if the years had slipped away from her. I saw her as a young and beautiful girl, end quote. Sheesh. He saw her as young, but he definitely knew that she wasn't. That would be a recurring theme in their relationship. Well, long story short, Madeleine and Enzo abandoned their respective spouses and married each other on November 27th, 1933. And just like her first marriage, this third one was also a scandal in high society and talked about in the newspapers. For her first marriage, her husband, J.J. Astor, was painted as the old creep who wanted a young plaything. For her third marriage, she was now in the role of the creep, and her husband, Enzo, was the young plaything. Here's what was written in a 1933 Christmas Day edition of the Garrett Clipper. Ladies and fighters. Society lifts an eyebrow as Mrs. Madeleine Force Dick is married to Enzo Fiermonte, an Italian prize fighter. Mrs. Dick happens to be the widow of Jacob Astor, who stepped aside as the Lusitania was sinking to permit his then youthful bride to take her place with the other women and children in a lifeboat. Okay, so let me stop there. Force was her maiden name and Dick was her second husband's name. And we all know that J.J. Astor died in the sinking of the Titanic, not the Lusitania. That is a crazy mistake for a newspaper to print because of the impact that Titanic had on the world at that time. The Lusitania was another grand, luxurious ocean liner that was owned by a different company from the owners of the Titanic. The Titanic was owned by the White Star Line, and the Lusitania was owned by Cunard. Cunard also owned the Carpathia, the ship that came to rescue Titanic's passengers. These companies were in constant competition to create the best vessels to transport the wealthy back and forth from Europe to the United States. The Lusitania, which was erroneously placed in this article, sank on May 7, 1915, 3 years after Titanic, after being torpedoed by German submarine U-20. Ironically, the Lusitania has a loose tie to the 1997 James Cameron Titanic movie. At the beginning of the film, when Rose sees the Titanic, She tells her fiancé that it doesn't look much more impressive than the Mauretania. The Mauretania was a sister ship to the Lusitania, and when she launched in 1906, she was the biggest ship on the sea, stretching out at 790 feet, which was beat out by Titanic's 883 feet. So it would have made perfect sense for people in those times to make those comparisons.
I don't see what all the fuss is about. It doesn't look any bigger than the Mauretania.
You could be blasé about some things, Rose, but not about Titanic. It's over 100 feet longer than Mauretania, and far more luxurious.
But back to the article. We also get a little more shade thrown at Madeleine's age. Astor's then youthful bride. Okay, we get it. She's not young. It goes on to read. Discussion of the marriage makes much of the tragic background of Fiermonte's bride. To think, say the dowagers, that Madeleine would do such a thing as marry a prize fighter after Astor's noble act in permitting her to be saved, while he himself went to certain death. But then, Mrs. Madeleine Astor Dick is a woman, after all. Enzo Fiermonte, even though he be a prize fighter, is a man. It is the inalienable privilege of any woman to marry any man, society's eyebrow to the contrary notwithstanding. So, this newspaper was definitely firing some shots at Enzo's low social standing, and also basically saying that Madeleine wasn't worth saving from the Titanic or Lusitania, now that her life had come to this. Oh well, she was all smiles at the beginning, but by the time that this was over, this marriage, Enzo made Madeleine wish that she had kept her home-wrecking ways back in 1909. For she would leave this relationship abused, bruised, and confused. So, about the broken arm. From the first time that Madeleine slept with Enzo on the Vulcania cruise ship, she was obsessed with him and she had to have him. He was her possession, and she paid for him to travel to all of her homes and luxury rentals all over the world. She was proud to call Enzo hers. In the winter of 1933, she rented a 15-room mansion in Palm Beach, and Enzo came there too. So did her son, John Jacob, and her doctor. Now, at this time, her son was 20, and he didn't hold back his opinions. He didn't like his mother being with Enzo, and he made it clear. So did the doctor. There were so many two-on-one arguments that eventually Enzo got fed up and left to go back to New York. But guess who left Florida to go find him? Yes, Madeleine had her chauffeur pull up to Enzo's gym where she retrieved her possession. He said that he saw the window of her car roll down, and a white glove came out of that window and signaled for him to come hither, and he did. As much as he admitted to not wanting to be with Madeleine, he also admitted that often he would play right into when she would chase him down. He said that he happily left his gym and went back to her New York home with her. The happiness between the two of them never lasted for long. They always argued about whether or not they should even be together, and he was always the one who thought that they should end it. He would leave or threaten to leave, then she would throw a few $1,000s his way or buy him something expensive, and then he would get happy for a few days and stay. Then the cycle would start all over again. Madeleine kept pressing him to get a divorce. Yes, even at this point they were both still married. Her plan was to have Enzo get a divorce, then she could pay a sum of $10,000 to Enzo's little boy back home in Italy, Gianni, and for the low price of $10,000, she could then have Enzo all to herself. So, even though, as this story progresses, it will be very clear to see that Enzo was horrible to her, Madeleine certainly had a part to play in this farce of a marriage, and she was not innocent. How selfish can a woman be? A mother at that, who was totally comfortable with the idea of giving a boy money, which was chump change to her, in the place of his father. She really didn't care about Enzo's wife and child, or about Enzo being a part of his child's life. Now, clearly, at some point, Enzo didn't care either, and I don't expect for her to care more about his family than he did. But I do find it odd, to say the least, when I see women who like being in romantic relationships with men who don't take care of their children. It's even worse when they support the bad behavior. Anyway, she told Enzo to write home to his wife and ask for a divorce. His wife, Tosca, wrote back and said she would never give him a divorce. She fought for him till the end. Her part in this gets crazier. But eventually, Tosca caved. That $10,000 wasn't a lot to Madeleine, but Tosca, according to several news outlets, was from, quote, peasant stock. And that $10,000 was a life-changing amount of money for someone like her. Adjusted for inflation, it had the buying power that $230,000 has today in 2023. So she agreed to take the money, but she still wanted her husband. A celebrity gossip reporter named Elsa Maxwell caught wind of the transaction and wrote, quote, John Jacob Astor's widow finally used part of her fortune to buy herself an Italian boxer for a husband, end quote. That reporter only wrote what everybody was thinking. She was paying to keep that young Italian man in her presence. Now, you can imagine that was a blow to Madeleine and Enzo. She looked like a desperate fool, and he was a loser who needed a woman to pay his way in life. In July of 1933, Madeleine's divorce was finalized. She celebrated by taking Enzo to Lake Tahoe and throwing her wedding ring into the lake. That part of her story disgusted me because the value of that ring could have done some good for someone somewhere. But I digress. Every move that Madeleine made was printed in the newspapers, and her divorce was no exception. But now, the divorce news was old. All of the reporters wanted to know when she was going to marry the young Italian boxer. Madeleine was used to the press following her for stories and quotes and photos. Enzo wasn't, and he didn't know how to handle it. When members of the press started swarming him and asking when he and Madeleine Astor were going to get married, he tried to play it off like he didn't know her very well. Astor? I hardly know her. Well, he really could not handle the pressure, so he told Madeleine once again that he was going to leave her, and he did. Again. This time, she hired private detectives to track him down so that she could go to him and bring him back. But even after she found him, he stuck to his guns. He told a reporter that he would never marry her because she's too old. He knew that Madeleine would see that, and he thought that it might make her leave him alone for good. It didn't. Madeleine had an attorney call Enzo to let him know that his wife, in Italy, agreed to the divorce settlement terms. So now he was free to marry Madeleine. Yay! He admitted that he challenged himself and questioned himself on what his attraction was to Madeleine, and he knew and told himself that it was her money. So when he finished his business with the attorney, he went to meet Madeleine in Bermuda to tell her that he was going to go to London to continue his boxing career. Again, he told her that he was going to leave her. He told her that she needed to marry a man from her own social class. And a lot of people would say that that was the reasonable and right thing for him to do and say. Well, Madeleine had a fit and told him, "You mean I'm too old?" He told her that it wasn't about her age, but that her way of living was wrong, and he didn't feel like a real man being a rich woman's possession. After he told her that, he turned to walk towards the door and leave. Then Madeleine caught up with him and grabbed his hair, telling him that he could not leave her. Enzo said that he pressed down on her with both of his arms so that she would release her grip on his hair. Well, he ended up pushing her to the floor. and breaking her arm. He picked her up and yelled for the doctor who was always with her. The doctor called for an ambulance. She was treated in a hospital in Bermuda for a few weeks and then eventually taken back to Manhattan to get full medical attention. She arrived back in New York on a stretcher, greeted by a mob of reporters and photographers that were able to catch some version of this image. She is trying to hide her face with her coat. Her son, William Dick Jr., is the one who was the closest to her stretcher, trying to help her cover her face and arm. She lied to everyone about why her arm was broken. The story that she told the news media was that she had slipped and fell on a highly polished floor in her vacation home. And it was right after this incident that the couple got married, while Madeleine was still in a hospital bed at the doctor's hospital on November 27, 1933. This article from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle on the day after the wedding tells that the dozen friends and intimates who attended were sworn to secrecy about the strange affair. But we do get to see who some of the attendees were. They included Madeleine's mother, Mrs. Force, who attended all 3 of her daughter's weddings. There was a mention that she was the most enthusiastic about the first wedding. Madeleine's mother was a big-time social climber, so I can imagine that she became increasingly less enthusiastic with each of Madeleine's spouses. And Madeleine's second husband was still a millionaire. He just didn't have Astor money, but who did? So I can only imagine that Mrs. Force's excitement level was somewhere in the gutter when she saw that Madeleine was going to go through with this marriage to Enzo. But back to the happy day. Madeleine's 3 sons all attended as well. But let's be clear. This was the wedding that no one wanted, except for Madeleine, not even Enzo. Just because her sons were there didn't mean that they approved. Even Vincent Astor, her stepson from John Jacob Astor's first marriage, did his part to keep Enzo away from Madeleine. In the same wedding article, it's mentioned that Enzo couldn't get to Madeleine at first while she was in Bermuda. Well, that was Vincent's doing. It is explained further in another article about the wedding from the same date in the Daily News. It explains that after Enzo's divorce was finalized, Madeleine put $5,000 in the bank for him, another one of her little treats for him and a thank you gift for going through with his divorce. Then he headed to meet her in Bermuda. But Vincent Astor, who had a lot of influence on the island, decided that Enzo shouldn't be allowed entry onto the island, so he wasn't, until Vincent changed his mind and allowed it. Vincent was the one with the real connections and way more money than John Jacob Astor, the Titanic baby. You might recall that John Jacob Astor left a $3 million trust for the John Jacob who Madeleine was pregnant with on the Titanic. That money was more than enough to make him rich in those times, but it was a lot less than his half-brother Vincent received from their father's will. And that was something that little John Jacob never seemed to get over. Well, that is day 1 of their marriage, and it only gets worse from here. Madeleine and Enzo had drummed up enough headlines just from their time openly dating while both were still married to other people. More headlines followed after the wedding, with reporters questioning why she left her quiet and successful husband to marry a broke boxer. Madeleine's stepson, Vincent Astor, tried to use his political connections on more than one occasion to keep Enzo away from her. In addition to not permitting him on the island of Bermuda when he met there to meet Madeleine before they got married, Vincent also pulled a stunt to prevent Enzo from re-entering the United States by phoning a friend of his, President Roosevelt. Yeah, I told you in part 2 that Vincent was the one with the real power and money. Unlike the Titanic baby, John Jacob, who couldn't pull any power moves like his half-brother. But instead, it seems that he took the route of acting out, almost like a cry for attention when he announced his engagement to a debutante just 1 week after his mother married the boxer. He never made it down the aisle with her, but just 6 months later, he got married to another Manhattan girl who fit the bill because she was also from a prominent family. Her name was Ellen Tuck French, and she was a cousin to the Vanderbilts. His mother showed up for his wedding, but his new penniless pugilist stepfather did not. But it seems like after this point, the atmosphere became a little more calm for the couple. For a few months, they were only being talked about in newspapers for being on vacation. Here they are almost 2 months exactly after the wedding on vacation in Palm Beach. Here they are a couple of weeks after that in Lake Worth, which is just about 10 miles away from Palm Beach, so likely on the same vacation. And about 2 weeks after that, not a photo of the couple, but of the home that Madeleine was paying to rent for their extended vacation. A mansion called Nuestro Paradiso, which means our paradise in Spanish. It had a private beach in the rear. And if ever a couple needed privacy, it was that pair. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't comment on the title of this blurb. Our paradise is Fiermonte Dick Home. That's what we've been saying about Madeleine this whole time. We all knew her motive, to have Fiermonte's dick at home. And about another 2 weeks after that, on February 25th, the couple appears in another paper, this time on Madeleine's new boat, which is simply called Fun. That is ironic. Most of their marriage was not smooth sailing and was far from anything that people would call fun. And surely enough, exactly 4 months later, on June 25th, there are signs of trouble in paradise, or at least the paradise that they were pretending existed between the two of them. An article titled, "Enzo Parts But Fails to Kiss the Missus" told its readers a few things. 1, clearly from the title, he left but didn't kiss his wife goodbye. Not a big deal if he was going to the store to grab some milk, but he was going to be gone from their West Hampton beach vacation home for at least a week. He had told a friend where he was going and said that he wasn't sure when he would come back. His reason for going? Business conferences. Now, he had 5 pieces of luggage and owned 0 businesses, but okay. 2, he had announced the Friday before this article was published that he was retiring from boxing, which was something that Madeleine desperately wanted him to do. 3, less than a week later, he was talking about getting back into the ring to fight. When questioned about whether getting back to boxing would upset his new bride, he said, quote, "I don't care if she is worth $5 million or $10 million. I'm boss in my house." End quote. 4, neighbors had reported that they saw Enzo yelling at his butler to get rid of photographers days before this story was published. Allegedly, he said, "Get that mob out of here or I'll catch hell." And yes, the neighbors were watching the newlyweds. Then, 2 months later, on August 21st, well, there's no story here, but they say that a picture says 1,000 words. The young, and I do stress young, lady in the photo with him is an actress named Toby Wing. The caption says that he was getting acting advice from her. Maybe he was. All that I'm going to say is, in all of the photos that I have gone through of him and Madeleine to research for this series, I have not seen one of him smiling at Madeleine like he is smiling at this young lady. And maybe he should have hurried up and applied whatever advice the young actress gave him to get an acting gig, because his next appearance in the news was the following month, on September 30th, getting his ass knocked out in a boxing match. Then, 2 months after that, the next piece of bad press was for Mrs. Fiermonte. She, along with Elliot Roosevelt, lost their Blue Book status. The Blue Book was merely a social register of the who's who in New York City. It let everybody know that you were a New Yorker with money and class. For Elliot, the second son of President Roosevelt, he took it pretty nonchalantly. He knew that his name was dropped from the register simply because he had moved from New York 2 years prior to them removing his name. But as for Madeleine, she was dropped from the register because of her marriage to Enzo. And this was society's way of telling her that you are a New Yorker with money, but class? Not so much. That was November of 1934, and really the last article that I see about either of them worth mentioning for that year. 1934 definitely ended on a bad note for the Union. But you know what they say, new year, new you. And the first January story that I found about them from 1935 showed that things were looking optimistic for these two insufferable donkeys. It's the Daily News, January 31st, and Madeleine is back to her old, creepy, foolish self in full swing. The article is called Overlook SOS, We're in Love, Enzo's latest. Here's the story that was reported. Enzo was headed back to Europe on an Italian liner called the SS Roma. He was leaving for Europe without his old wife. Not only did he leave without Madeleine, but another woman saw him off. As he was getting ready to board the ship, goodbyes were exchanged between him and a woman named Mrs. Adela Rogers St. John's. Now, I'm not saying that she was having an affair with Enzo, but I'm not saying that she wasn't. I will simply say that she looked like this, as opposed to how his wife looked. And shortly after her dealings with Enzo, her husband wanted a divorce from her. So, while Enzo is saying his goodbyes to Adela, and she's standing on the pier, waiting until the ship leaves with her friend on it, little does he know that his crazy old wife is already on the ship. Yes, while he was saying see ya later to his friend, Adela, his wife slipped right past him and got on the ship. Madeleine intentionally did not register her name on the passenger list because she wanted to surprise her hubby. And apparently she did just that. The story doesn't give details on exactly how it happened, but at some point after Enzo realized that his wife was on the ship, he was excited to see her. My guess is that he knew that she would give him some more allowance money to spend on his European vacation that he clearly had no intention of her being a part of before. Nevertheless, he sent a radiogram to one of his friends expressing his happiness due to the discovery of Madeleine on his ship. It read, quote, "Wife's aboard, God help me. In spite of previous statements in the press, I am glad to say that Mrs. Fiermonte and I are reconciliated," end quote. The next day, February 1st, newspapers would print why Enzo had a change of heart. See, he got on the SS Roma to sneak away from Madeleine, but while they were on the ship, she wrote a series of love letters and apology letters to him, having a ship steward carry them to his room eventually, like after a few days at sea. But while she was in her cabin writing love letters, Enzo was running his mouth all over the ship, bragging about how he had escaped from his wife. This Daily News story from February 1st, 1935, gives a little more of the backstory on this loving reunion. The article is titled, "Enzo Couldn't Resist Wife's Tender Notes." Now, I just have to wonder, because those gossip columnists were so shady in the 1930s, was this an intentional play on words because both tender and notes mean legal currency or money? And by this point, everyone was well aware that Enzo was far more attracted to Madeleine's money than any other thing about her. So let me know if you think that that writer was being funny with this title. The story makes it clear that for Enzo, the so-called Italian Apollo, this trip was a voyage of escape that somehow turned into a second honeymoon. He became very popular on the ship from day one, and on his first day on the voyage, he was telling all of the strangers in the ship's main saloon that he had made a quote-unquote clean getaway. It was written that he sarcastically waved goodbye to the Statue of Liberty, and then made his way to the ship's gymnasium for a medicine ball workout with the instructor on board. What he told the instructor was in the paper too. Workout grunts included. Quote, "It is marvelous to be free," he said as the heavy ball flew back and forth. "No more private detectives shadowing me. No more gossip. Only Algiers and Marseille and a visit to my first wife and our child. Ah, and I was very smart in slipping out the way I did." End quote. Meanwhile, old dum-dum Madeleine had locked herself in her cabin and committed her time to writing love letters that she was certain would win him back. At some point, those letters were delivered to Enzo's room by a steward who said that Enzo's face went white when he saw who wrote the letters. Then he wrote back to her and they started writing back and forth to each other. After a whole day of writing until midnight, Enzo was adamant in telling Madeleine that he did not want to be with her. They wrote some more letters the next day. Then he reluctantly agreed to meet her for dinner in her cabin. After that dinner, his own cabin was not occupied for the next 2 nights, nor was he seen at the main saloon with the friends he had made on his first day, who were laughing at his jokes about Madeleine. And we know from before that he got around to saying that they were back together and that he was so happy. In case you didn't know what happened before, parts 1, 2, and 3 are linked in the description box. Now, we know that part of Enzo's plans on his getaway was to see his first wife. Well, Madeleine didn't know that. And when she learned, literally just 1 week after it was reported that they were back in love, it was obvious to see that she didn't like that Enzo was going to see his family back home. As this headline from the February 8th Star Gazette explains, Madeleine cried, lost it, and cut off his allowance. Just the day before, she was confidently telling the press that she and Enzo were going to have big fun in France. Well, what a difference a day makes, because on this day, she was reported as being semi-hysterical, just repeating over and over, "I can't say anything. I don't know anything about this. I don't know what I'm going to do." She said that, but she did quickly figure out one thing to do. She cut off his money. Frankly, at this point, he should have seen that coming, and I don't feel sorry for either one of these people. Madeleine was sad because she didn't have Enzo. Enzo was sad because he didn't have Madeleine's money. But one person was happy, Tosca, Enzo's first wife. She said, quote, "When I met him in Genoa, he was very happy to see me and our child. There were tears in his eyes. We went to a cafe and spent some hours together. Yes, I still love him dearly. I think he loves me. He may come back to me, but not immediately." End quote. My God, what was it about this man? The next few days, there were a number of headlines about Enzo and his first wife meeting each other. All of them expressed something along the lines of Enzo meets wife number 1 and wife number 2 cried about it. Even though he made it clear that he met Tosca and had love for her and his son, he also made it clear that he was staying with Moneybags Madeleine. His mother weighed in and seemed to approve of his decision. She told the Daily News, quote, "My son really loves the American lady a great deal. Although she is older than he, Enzo says she seems much younger than she is." End quote. Something tells me that if Madeleine hadn't been rich, that his mother would not have approved of her son's love match. But she was rich. And even though wife number 1 wanted her husband back from wife number 2, she still had a reason to be happy that Madeleine had entered her life. With the money that Madeleine had sent to Tosca in exchange for her husband, Tosca, the peasant, was able to buy a nice apartment for herself and quit her job at a shirt factory. And she was happy about that. The one who wasn't happy was Madeleine. She didn't like the publicity that she and her husband had been getting on this trip to Italy. All of the papers were really playing up the fact that he would wander about and do as he pleased without his wife. I can understand why she didn't like that, even if it was true, and it was. The news stories were also talking about how much Enzo loved his son, Giovanni. She didn't like that either. That is one part about Madeleine that I just do not like. She really had a problem with the fact that Enzo loved his son. It seems like she just wanted him to be so mesmerized by her money that he would forget that he had a whole family before he met her. Her problem with the way that she was being reported on during the Italian fiasco was that she was being called, quote, an American millionairess who is jealous. Well, if the shoe fits. But in less than 2 weeks' time, Madeleine would be smiling again because she was going to use the one thing that she had that kept her husband crawling back to her: her money. She would give his wife another 5-figure payday in exchange for Enzo in a once-and-for-all no-backsies deal. And she would buy Enzo a brand new car in exchange for some affection from him for a few days. So now it's time for Moneybags Madeleine to shell out some dough so that she can keep that hunk of a man who hates her guts. She snuck onto his ship when she found out that he was on his way to Italy. At this point in February of 1935, everybody was in Italy: Enzo, his first wife and son, and Madeleine. And it was looking like Enzo was going to have to stay longer than he planned because the Italian government was holding his passport. The reason that he was given was that Italy was not going to recognize his divorce from his first wife, Tosca. Instead, they would charge him with bigamy and lock him up in prison. Usually, a problem for Enzo meant a problem for Madeleine, but she was actually okay with the idea of his being locked away because at least in prison, there wouldn't be any other women she'd have to compete with for his affection. I'm not even joking. Check out this headline from the Buffalo News: Enzo's wife fearful of U.S. girls' wiles. Therefore, Madeleine planned to keep her lovely boy, as she called him, away from New York. Sounds like a great plan to me. All that Madeleine wanted was to live in peace with her lovely boy, who she also called a god and a Greek statue. But the pesky young girls just wouldn't leave him alone and let him be faithful. Luckily for her, the Italian authorities had locked him up so that no women could get to him, not even his lawful wife, Tosca. Wait a minute, doesn't that make Madeleine a paranoid hypocrite? I think that it does. She was lucky to have him behind bars, and he was lucky that she had a lot of money. She would end up sticking by his side and paying to get him out. Literally just one day and $17,000 later, Enzo's problems were solved. Tosca settled on 200,000 lira as a settlement to make the divorce a reality. I guess that she liked big round numbers. That's a little more than $375,000 in today's currency that Madeleine shelled out to get her man back. But she wasn't done spending. Of course she had to get him a little treat for all of his trouble. So she bought him a brand new fancy sports car, and the couple made plans to leave Italy and ride off into the sunset with France as their next destination, Cannes to be exact. While they were waiting on Enzo's passport to be returned, which took a few days, another interesting thing occurred when Madeleine entertained Tosca, aka Mrs. Fiermonte No. 1, for tea at her luxurious hotel. I'm sure that Enzo loved that. Unfortunately for us nosy Mestorians, Enzo's mother also attended this tea, and all of the quotes in the papers are from her. It's the same old stuff. She liked Enzo's new rich wife. She knew that Madeleine was older than her son, but she seemed the same age as her son. She seemed really young. Blah, blah, blah. Whatever you say, Mom. Just keep those dollars rolling into the family, right? But we do get this interesting description of Tosca. She's called the fighter's sturdy, black-haired first wife, who comes from Italian peasant stock. Ouch. Now, I have to take just a quick moment to defend Tosca. This photo of her was used almost all of the time in the newspapers, but in March of 1935, I saw this photo. Clearly she used some of that money that Madeleine paid her to get a makeover, but in all of my research, I only saw this photo of her once. But I digress. What happened on March 9th more than makes up for the snooze fest printed in the papers about the two wives meeting. Well, Enzo took Madeleine to France in that new car she got for him, and this subheadline summed up what happened next rather succinctly. Enzo Fiermonte, dapper Italian prizefighter, and his second wife, Mrs. Madeleine Force Astor Fiermonte, made a hasty exit out a side door of their hotel today when Enzo's first wife, Tosca, roared into town on the Rome Express, volubly proclaiming she had come to reclaim him. Okay, so here's what happened. Madeleine and Enzo called themselves going on honeymoon number 2. So they were getting ready to step out for the evening to do the Riviera. Well, Tosca had taken a train to France to track them down, and she did just that. Why? Because she wanted her man back. You see how the papers followed and printed their every move. So Tosca knew their hotel, so she thought. But they switched their plans and went to a different hotel, and she still tracked them down. When she arrived at the hotel, she demanded the front desk staff to allow her entry to Enzo's suite. They flat out denied her request, as they should have. She explained to the workers in what was described as strong language that she had come to collect her man, regardless of the money that his wife had paid her and would continue to pay her. She argued back and forth with them for a while, but they never gave her access to Enzo's room. So she settled for a room as close to their suite as she could get. Now, this was not a quiet conversation that she was having with the hotel staff, so Enzo and Madeleine could hear everything. So, as Tosca was settling into her room so that she could wait for an Enzo appearance in the hallway in the middle of the night, he and Madeleine slipped out of a side door of the building, got into his new car, thank goodness it was a race car, and they made their escape. Again, I ask, what was it about this man? Meanwhile, on the very same day as all of this commotion, Enzo's lady friend, the one who he was saying goodbyes to when he left for Europe, thinking that Madeleine didn't know, Adela Rogers St. John, her husband was trying to divorce her because of her affiliation with Enzo Fiermonte. One of the hardest parts for me to understand in this story is why a woman who had been married to 2 millionaires, one of them among the richest men in the world, would drain her bank account to be in a marriage like this one. Anyway, they were on the run. They got away from wife number 1. Meanwhile, Enzo had lied to the press about ever having seen his first wife in Italy, or that he had ever been charged with bigamy, even though all of this had been very well documented. Maybe someone could have found all of the drama that surrounded Enzo to be exciting, but all of this seems like way too much for a normal person to bear, and Madeleine just appeared to be aging by the second. Her friends were starting to feel sorry for her and her crazy life. They were commenting on how her beauty was just gone. And according to the few society friends that were still willing to allow her to come around, Enzo was starting to demand money from her and beat her. That was their norm for the next 2 years. Then in July of 1937, Enzo put his hands on someone else, a man this time. He loved driving his sports cars fast. That earned him a speeding charge. Well, he never answered the charge. The charge was from 1934, 3 years before. He was just irresponsible. God knows that Madeleine had the money to pay for the ticket, and she would have paid for it if he had told her about it. So he ended up getting sentenced to 5 days at Rikers Island prison. At his sentencing, the press was there, just like they had been for every moment of his life since he had been with Madeleine. He should have expected it. But when reporters were questioning him about being sentenced, he punched one of the cameramen twice, landing a left and a right far more successfully than he had been able to do in the boxing ring. I guess that he would have won more fights if his opponents had been holding big cameras, and they were not expecting him to hit them. Enzo showed up hours late to this court date, and the judge wasn't having it. That's why he was sentenced to time behind bars. The judge didn't even offer an alternative like paying a fine, and he told Enzo, among other things, quote, "Foreigners like you should not flout the law," end quote. Well, I guess that was 5 days of rest for Madeleine. And she needed it, because according to her handful of friends, Enzo spent the second half of 1937 beating her more frequently and taking more of her money. They said that he broke her wrist and broke her ribs. She was always in bed recovering from one of his attacks. He eventually, on one occasion, quote, beat her senseless, unquote, and that is what caused their final separation, initiated by Madeleine. In May of 1938, Madeleine was staying in Palm Beach and finally decided to go a step further than the separation and file for divorce. She did so on the grounds of extreme cruelty, citing that he, one, had knocked her down, and I didn't know if that was in reference to the incident before they got married in which he broke her arm, but two, broke her wrist, three, hit her with a fist after a dance, and four, was exceedingly unpleasant. Now, I said that I wasn't sure what Madeleine meant about her charge that Enzo had once knocked her down. As we know, he knocked her down to the floor and broke her arm before they got married, remember? She was in the hospital recovering from the broken arm when she said "I do" to him. Well, I first learned about her accusations against Enzo in a book that I will list in my sources for this video series. Well, that led me to do some digging, and this is what I found. This article that was printed in the Daily News Sunday edition on June 12, 1938, called "Enzo Beat Her, Says Rich Wife." Now that Madeleine had been quickly granted her divorce, the way that the papers had been harping on her for looking old, they were now harping on her ex-husband for having been a terrible boxer. Here's how the story of the divorce begins. Quote, accounts of the closely guarded decision, reaching here from West Palm Beach, revealed that Enzo used on the Astor widow the uppercuts and left hooks that he failed to deliver in the American prize ring. End quote. Madeleine's accounts of Enzo's abuse were substantiated in court by her own sister, a maid who had worked for her and Enzo, and her physician. These are the accounts that include the charges that Madeleine put forth against Enzo when she filed for her divorce. The first sign of trouble occurred only 7 months into the marriage in June of 1934, when Enzo wanted $50,000. Madeleine didn't give him the money he wanted, so in response, he left her. Left their home in New York City altogether. He went off gallivanting in several places with several women. At least one of those places was California. He returned home when he was ready. Early the next year, in 1935, more than half a year later. Then, who can forget their magical reconciliation after he ran away from her? Or so he thought, only to find that she had made her way onto his escape cruise to Italy. Well, the papers printed the story of how they got back together, but in court, Madeleine told what the reporters didn't know. Quote, the reconciliation was short-lived, the divorce papers showed yesterday. For on the boat, Enzo committed sundry acts of extreme cruelty. He on several occasions struck the plaintiff, knocking her down. Mrs. Fiermonte related that she was ill at the time, and her illness was augmented by his acts of violence. End quote. Then, while they were in Italy, when Madeleine shelled out an extra $17,000 on top of the $10,000 that she had already paid in order to, quote-unquote, keep Enzo, yes, on that same trip, he left her at their hotel in Naples while he went out with other women. That was the same time in Europe that Enzo and Madeleine fled their hotel because his first wife came looking for him and raising hell at their hotel because she wanted him back. You might remember that Enzo and Madeleine took his new sports car to France, and that made for a cute little romantic story to put in the newspapers. But here's what happened while they were there. Quote, "While in Paris, they went to a rustic restaurant 60 miles out from the metropolis. Enzo left her and drove away in their car. Night fell. Mrs. Fiermonte had no idea how to get back to Paris, and finally began making inquiries. At this juncture," her complaint narrated, "the defendant returned, became enraged because she had spoken to anyone about being stranded, knocked her down, breaking her right wrist." End quote. This whole time that she had been fighting Enzo's first wife to get custody, if you will, of Enzo, Enzo was beating her and cheating on her. Did she just need to have a win against his first wife for the sake of her ego? Anyway, then, in Nice, he deserted her once again, not at a restaurant this time, on the waterfront. When he finally drove up to get her, he was teasing her, making her follow the car. You know the thing where someone comes to open the car door, then the driver scoots the car up just enough so that the person trying to get in can't grab the handle to open the door? That's what he was doing. And she testified that it went on until she had walked quite a distance. The following summer, the couple returned to the United States and lived in New York, Hot Springs, and Charleston, and in all three places the beatings continued, or as the Daily News described them, ring caresses. But this is what led up to what Madeleine called a grand assault in Newport, Rhode Island. The Fiermontes were visiting Madeleine's sister, Catherine. She was also a socialite who had married a rich man. They all went to a dance together. Then, according to Madeleine and her sister, when they returned to their room, Enzo, completely unprovoked, struck Madeleine after having had a night out that everyone agreed was just a really nice time. This time he was said to have knocked her down and bruised her. I find it odd that she called this the grand assault, considering that up until this point he had already broken her arm and broken her wrist. Because I do see Madeleine as someone who had an ego problem, I wonder if this occasion was the grand assault, as she put it, because it happened in front of people she knew, people in front of whom she had been pretending that her marriage with Enzo was a happy one. Then, she didn't even go into details about almost the whole year of 1937. She just said that he had become exceedingly unpleasant, striking her often and being otherwise cruel. But there was one date that she called out specifically, which clearly was her breaking point, a date in 1937. Here is what the Daily News printed, quote, "On August 4th, 1937, the warring pair sailed for Europe again. In Paris, Enzo beat her inhumanly, demanding money, claiming she had neglected to pay his monthly cash allowance. Her long-suffering endurance of his conduct was finally exhausted, and after a trip to Vienna, she returned to the United States alone." End quote. Enzo didn't even bother showing up to court to deny the allegations on his own behalf. By Madeleine's day in court, Enzo's attorney had already made arrangements for Enzo to receive roughly 1/3 of a severance settlement that she had promised to pay him. So he was living it up in France with some women who were in his car when he crashed it. We'll get to that. But many of the newspapers ran the stories of Madeleine's divorce and Enzo's car crash side by side on the same pages, some even joking that it was good that he had the rest of Madeleine's settlement money coming his way because he would need to use most of it to pay off the victims that he had injured with his reckless driving. Yes, there was a severance package that no attorney, no judge, or any jury required her to pay Enzo. Even with all of these allegations claimed against him, she still sent him off with a severance package, a final settlement of $150,000, which is equivalent to roughly $3.2 million today. Was this one last attempt to buy his love? Maybe, but it really did seem like she just wanted to be done. And now that Enzo had such a big chunk of her money, he seemed to be okay with being done. He'd never had so much of Madeleine's money at one time. She would spend money on him, but not give it to him. She'd buy him whatever he wanted. For instance, when she purchased her home on 600 acres in South Carolina, he wanted a few minor upgrades: a tennis court, a dog racing track, a yacht dock, and a skeet field. She willingly granted him all of those luxuries, anything that he could enjoy at home with her. He was given expensive gifts and allowances of thousands of dollars at a time in the past, but with this small fortune, this $150,000 settlement from Madeleine, he could finally break away, stop pretending he loved Madeleine, and do what and who he wanted. And that's just what he did, and didn't waste any time doing it. Enzo got out of New York and went back to Europe. This time, he didn't have to sneak away like a thief in the night, and Madeleine didn't follow him to surprise him this time either. He was living it up in France with as many women as he wanted to see. Madeleine was finally done with him. But guess who wasn't? Tosca, wife number 1. As is told in a Brooklyn Daily Eagle story from 1938, appropriately titled Waiting Wife. At this point, Enzo was being called a motor car speedster boxer. Well, we know that he liked to speed and box the people who reported on it, so I guess that's fair. Now, this was all literally happening at the same time that Madeleine was being granted her divorce from Enzo. Tosca declared to the press that Enzo was the only man she ever loved or will love, and she said that she'd be happy to take him back after he was done having his fun with other women. Well, it's good that she knew that she would need to wait her turn, because either on the day or the day after the divorce was finalized, Enzo was in the papers because he was driving his sports car in France in a village near Dijon with not 1, not 2, but 3 women. Unfortunately for one of those young beauties, she was injured in a car accident that Enzo caused when he was speeding and crashed his sporty car right into a tree, causing the car to overturn, thus injuring Marion Whitworth, a 26-year-old actress whose brother had died years before in an auto accident. This accident earned him another prison sentence. And knowing all of that, wife number 1 still wanted him back. Well, that car wreck was on him and had nothing to do with Madeleine. She had divorced him and even paid him well after she had suffered years of beatings. So that would be it, right? Wrong. The very next year, in 1939, Enzo would serve her one more blow, but it wouldn't come from his fist this time, though she probably would have preferred a punch instead of what he did. Before spring could even get underway, Enzo had sold the story of his marriage to a publication called True Story magazine. Every embarrassing detail of how Madeleine had been a fool for him, how she paid to keep him because she didn't think that she could get anybody else, how she knew that her looks were fading, how she knew that other women wanted her husband, and how she knew that other women were having her husband, and how she felt too insecure to compete with them because she had lost her beauty. All of it was available for the world to read in the February, March, and April issues of True Story in a series called Kept Husband. It was labeled as, quote, one of the most startling and illuminating commentaries on life among the idle rich ever written, end quote. And Madeleine couldn't take it. Whatever people had only suspected before, they now knew. It was what they had imagined and worse. The little bit of a reputation she had was now in shambles. She slipped into a deep depression, and she wanted to end her life. She grew more and more dependent on prescription drugs throughout 1939. The following year, in January of 1940, She left her home in Charleston to go back to Palm Beach. In what had been a life full of trips, that would be her last one. On March 27th of the same year, she died at the age of 46. Very close to the age of her husband who had died on the Titanic. John Jacob Astor was 47. Her official cause of death was heart failure, but her friends believed that she had intentionally overdosed on pills. Her estate was worth $1.1 million when she died, and that was split equally between the two sons she had with her second husband, William Carl Dick. She figured that John Jacob Astor, the Titanic baby, would have had more than he needed from the trust that his father's Titanic death had left him. As for her final husband, Enzo Fiermonte's words on her death, quote, "Madeleine carried her doubts with her always, like her pearls." End quote. Okay, whatever that means. He went on to live out his dreams. He wanted to be an actor, and he appeared in over 100 movies and TV shows from the 1940s until the 1980s. Now, I don't know any of the films listed in his IMDb profile. Some of them are Italian, but I see that among dozens of roles, he played military men of various ranks, a boxer, a character named Enzo, and even Al Capone. How's that for life? Enzo was never really into Madeleine, and he wasn't too fond of her firstborn son either, calling the younger John Jacob a poor little rich boy. Though Madeleine didn't leave her first son any money, she did leave him 2 pieces of her jewelry, a pearl necklace that was valued at just over $1,500, and a diamond solitaire ring that was worth over $50,000. I'd like to think that those pieces had sentimental value. She was almost always photographed wearing a 2-strand pearl necklace. Perhaps the ring was the one that John Jacob used to propose to her. That would have been touching if those were the 2 pieces that she was able to leave to her son. He was the baby who Madeleine was carrying on the Titanic, who she named after his father. He was also John Jacob Astor, but he was also known as the Titanic baby. And even though he was born into wealth, he had a lot of troubles of his own. This is a story about a rich boy who grew up to be a rich, miserable man. And if it weren't for his family's money, he'd have had no identity at all. He survived the sinking of the Titanic, in a way. His mother was a few months pregnant, carrying him, when she and her husband were on the Titanic, returning to America from their honeymoon in Egypt and Europe. She was Madeleine Astor, the wife of John Jacob Astor IV, the richest passenger on the ship. Their son was John Jacob Astor VI, though he was also called the Titanic baby, and later on in his life, the rich boy nobody wants. John Jacob Astor VI was an American socialite more than anything, and a businessman, arguably to a much lesser degree. He was the 3rd child of his father, John Jacob Astor IV, and the 1st child of his mother, Madeleine Force Astor. His father never got to lay eyes on his son because he died a gentleman's death on the Titanic on April 15, 1912, seeing to it that his young, teenage wife made it safely into a lifeboat. He reportedly helped many other women and children get into lifeboats and even went to the ship's kennel to release the dogs on board and gave them a fighting chance. 4 months later, almost exactly 4 months later, on August 14th, the young widow, Madeleine Astor, gave birth to her baby boy, who was almost immediately dubbed the Titanic baby, John Jacob Astor VI. He weighed in at almost 8 pounds, a big boy born into big money. I can only imagine that his father thought that he had a second lease on life and was looking forward to returning home from his honeymoon with his new wife and starting the second chapter of his life. But that didn't stop him from having a will in place, in case the worst happened. And the worst did happen. But all was well. The Titanic baby slid out of his mom's uterus right into a $3 million fortune. His trust fund that J.J. Astor IV set up in his will for any spare kids that came along. It was definitely an afterthought and not anything specific like he had for Madeleine or his daughter Ava. And the Titanic baby's measly $3 million trust was nothing like what his father had left for his older half-brother, Vincent. Because Vincent was left with almost all of his father's vast fortune of $85 million. All of their father's luxury mansions and hotels, and roughly $70 million went to Vincent. And that became a thorn in the Titanic baby's side as soon as he understood what money was. And it remained a problem for him well into his adult years, even after Vincent died. And speaking of Vincent, he was not present for the birth of his new brother, and his absence seemed to foreshadow what their relationship would become. Distant at best. Everything about young John Jacob was about money, and for the remainder of this video, I'll do my best to call him young John Jacob as a means of differentiating between his father, the fourth. I'll also refer to him as Jakey, which was the nickname that the press seemed to use for him most often. And while I'm on a tangent, this often comes up, so I'll address it concisely right now. If the father is John Jacob Astor IV, why is the son the sixth and not the fifth? Long story short, there was a branch of Astors who made a wonderful living for themselves in England, and John Jacob Astor, the first Baron Astor of Hever, was born before our young John Jacob of today's story, so he was officially the fifth, and the American was the sixth, another thorn in Jakey's side. Now, back to our story. On the day that he was born, Manhattan was in a frenzy. He was America's version of nobility. Manhattan was buzzing as though a new prince had been born. Police officers had to stand guard on the Astors block and fight off crowds of people who were hoping to catch a glimpse of the newborn baby. But most of the talk about young John Jacob had to do with money. And in one of the very first news articles written about him on the very first day after his birth, there was a lot of discussion about his $3 million trust. Mainly a rumor that his grandparents on his mother's side wanted to contest the will of young John's father, because they didn't think that $3 million was enough for the boy. Mind you, we're talking $3 million in 1912, which today in 2023 has the buying power of about $94 million. Would that be enough for you? If that would not be enough money for you because you have substantially more, email me if you're looking for a girlfriend. Somewhere, a rumor was started that the will would be contested so that the Titanic baby would be given just as much money as his older half-brother, Vincent Astor. The story grew legs when the baby was given his father's full name at birth, the assumption being that his mother deliberately gave him that name to make her case stronger when it came time to contest the will. But according to his maternal grandfather, William Forrest, none of that was true. His words, quote, "The report that there will be a contest of Mr. Astor's will is all nonsense. All these reports of a contest are nonsense," end quote. So, $3 million was all that this poor baby was going to get, and it would have been the same if he'd been born a girl. That was just the amount that his father settled on for any additional children other than Ava, who received $10 million, and Vincent, who inherited the lion's share, $69 million. But only $3 million for his little half-brother, which was nothing special in the Astor family. And the Titanic baby himself would prove to be nothing special as he grew into adulthood. But at this point in his new life, there it was. $3 million was enough for the baby, until it wasn't. which was around the time that he turned 4 years old. We'll get there. But in the meantime, his mother, Madeleine Astor, had made her mourning plans public. The standard for an upper-class widow in this period was to publicly express her mourning through her clothing, and usually for a period of 2 years, in which she would wear black and other very dark-colored dresses and jet black mourning jewelry, literally made from the mineral called jet. And Madeleine did mourn her husband in this way for 2 years, retired from public life inside of the Astor Fifth Avenue mansion with her baby. And even though they weren't doing anything besides staying home, Madeleine soon realized that the scheduled monthly withdrawals for the care of the young John Jacob would not be enough to cover his expenses. In November of 1912, Jakey was approaching the age of 3 months. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle had printed yet another article about his finances. This one laid out how his mother, as his financial guardian, would schedule yearly withdrawals for his day-to-day care, and how she planned to help him earn interest on the account so that he would have accrued a lot more additional interest until the trust was eventually turned over to his own care. She requested only $10,000 per year from his trust, saying that that amount would cover his needs. Now, I've never had a child, but that $10,000 in 1912 had the buying power of just over $315,000 today. Would that be enough for one of your children? Madeleine only wanted the $10,000 per year for 3 years, after which she would support her son with her own money. Her goal was to allow her son's millions to collect interest so that he would have even more millions by the time that he reached the age of maturity. Specifically, she hoped that her plan would turn his $3 million into about $10 million by the time the boy turned 21. And I think that that's good looking out on her part. But his mother wasn't the only one who was looking out for him. In May of 1913, when the young Astor was only 9 months old, a tidal wave of presents for him landed at his Fifth Avenue mansion. The Titanic baby mania had taken over the world, and people from all over were sending him presents: infant wear, lace-lined bassinets and cribs. And I'm sure that it seemed like a kind, even if a little bit creepy, gesture to most people, except for the one secretary who had the duty of returning to sender each and every single item. I don't have an explanation for why this happened all of a sudden. It wasn't his birthday. The anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic had passed by this time, and I'm almost sure that invariably each of those presents came from people who were not as well off as the Astors, because practically everyone in the world had less money than the Astors. The next time little Jakey was discussed in the news, it was back to the money. This is when the public learned that $10,000 per year was in fact not enough to care for the Titanic baby. Truth be told, his mother had figured that out the second year of his life and had already increased his allowance from $10,000 per year to $20,000 per year, roughly $620,000 in today's money. But he didn't make the papers because the allowance increase had been exposed. He made the news because his mother realized that even $20,000 was not enough money to care for him on an annual basis, and she'd had to dig in her own pockets to loan her baby son $7,590 just so that his expenses for the previous year were in the clear. Now, in all fairness, I have to say that the young John Jacob had a number of expenses that most toddlers didn't have, and they included, but were not limited to, attorneys, a physician and a nurse, estate taxes, income taxes, and mansion maintenance expenses. Altogether, his yearly expenses were just over $27,000, and his mother went to court to request a little extra money from his trust to cover the cost of his care. This wasn't the only noteworthy moment in Jakey's life when he was 4. That same year, his mother married her second husband, the successful and sensible banker Carl Dick. This union gave the young John Jacob 2 younger half-brothers, William Jr., and John. They spent their days traveling from place to place: New York, Florida, Rhode Island, and Europe. From this point on, for most of his childhood, the young John Jacob was kept away from the press. His mother was so occupied with making her new blended family work that she no longer had the time to manage Jakey's trust, so she turned that over to his oldest half-brother, Vincent. During this time in his life, young John Jacob had a tutor who made it known that Jakey was not a bright student, nor, despite having a wealthy upbringing, did he possess any social charm. This tutor was James Noble Gifford, and he made these details about Jakey known in a tell-all book called Caviar for Breakfast, a book that used pseudonyms to talk about its subjects, but everyone knew that it was very clear that he was writing about Jakey. James Gifford had tutored many wealthy students, but several chapters in his book were dedicated to a student named Jack, who he described as the best-known boy in the world. He wrote that the boy had very expensive taste, loved caviar for breakfast, and refused to ride in any car except his own because other vehicles were too common. He also threw in an anecdote about the boy only riding the elevator in his house to get from one level to the next. Even if the elevator was broken, he'd wait for it to be repaired before he took the stairs up or down. Side note about James Noble Gifford: the proximity that he gained to New York's wealthy as a tutor was something that he used against the elite in novel after novel. He wrote a number of books in the 1930s, all exposing the extremely rich for being extremely lazy and lacking morality. And the novels seemed to sell really well. So I made a video about how a lot of wealthy white people who lived during the Gilded Age funded the construction of a lot of buildings at historically black universities. At the end of that video, I mentioned that the name Astor is on a building at the St. George School in Rhode Island, near Newport. At that time, I knew that Vincent Astor had donated money to the school, but I didn't know that Jakey Astor had also attended the school, and boy oh boy was he unpopular. If this school had those fun yearbook categories, he would have been voted least likely to succeed and most likely to be an ass. Even though the things that his former tutor had written about him seemed to be mean, they also seemed to have a ring of truth when compared to what his classmates said about him. By the time Jakey was a teenager, his high society peers would talk behind his back about his extreme arrogance and horrible manners. They said that he was never at the top of his class and went about his schooling as though he didn't care about it. And he didn't. It wasn't like he needed a good education so that he could get a good job. He was born into more money than he'd ever need. So he put little effort into his expensive education, so little that he didn't even finish that school. He wasn't really interested in getting into college or pursuing a career. His interests were cars and movies. School was just a place for him to brag about being the only living John Jacob Astor, and he would do that, literally, even though it wasn't true that he was the only living John Jacob Astor. The fifth had been born before him, 26 years before him, and was living as a true gentleman with a title and everything in England. And while Jakey was bragging about being the only living John Jacob Astor, J.J. Astor V was alive and well on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and didn't die until 1971. Now, there was some point when Jakey was a teenager that he had another major life change. Madeleine, his mother, had pretty much given up on him after she said that he had a governess who had turned him against everyone and everything. And during these years, before he reached the age of majority, it seems like maybe from the time of 16 or so, he lived on his own, without any parents or guardians, at an apartment in the Savoy Plaza. In 1932, when young Jacob was 20, he tried his hand at love. He was on a vacation in Italy where he met a young woman his same age. Her name was Donna Cristina Torlonia. She was reported to be a beauty, a statuesque blonde with blue eyes. They saw each other often and were seen out and about and having fun for his whole trip. Then suddenly it was announced that they were engaged to be married. Apparently Jakey and Donna had not only gotten engaged, but they started planning their wedding because the news got leaked by a friend of Donna's who said that she was going to be a bridesmaid. Now, this was 1932, a time when people generally did not enter into marriage as lightly as many do today, and people as young as Jakey and Donna from wealthy families certainly would have had many discussions before planning what would have been a big society wedding. He just proposed without asking her parents, and there was no chance in hell that that was going to work, even if he was an Astor. Donna's mother told the papers that the whole idea was absurd, and Jakey, who thought that his name and money meant everything in the world, was left in disbelief, not understanding why the Torlonias wouldn't jump at the chance to welcome him as their son-in-law. Well, believe it or not, that would not be the last time that young John Jacob would try to marry a girl without her parents' permission and get rejected. He also tried unsuccessfully to rush a Susie Hopkins and a LeBrun Kruger Rhinelander down the aisle with him. But on his 21st birthday, he was officially a man, and he received his trust money. The $3 million had grown to at least $5 million, about $118 million today, and he could do whatever he wanted to do with it. But it was likely closer to $10 million. The true amount was never disclosed to the press. Now he finally possessed the money that was the only thing that had ever made him newsworthy. Being a rich baby turned rich kid and now rich young adult seemed to be his only identity. Nobody ever said that he was smart or cute or charming or kind. Well, there was Big. He was called Big in his birth announcements, but other than that, he was just the rich Titanic kid who also had a reputation for being a snob. And now he was the rich Titanic adult, able to make of his life whatever he wanted. And even he went on continuing to make his money his identity. One of his first purchases was a yellow Rolls-Royce that seemed to be his favorite car. It wouldn't take long before he'd have an entire fleet of about 10 luxury automobiles. His mother's third husband said Jakey would drive each one every day, as if they were horses that needed to be exercised for a while. Jakey also used a private railroad car to get to longer distances, though sometimes he was known to hire a private railroad car to take himself and his friends just on short distance trips that anyone else would have just taken by car. If there was a way that he could spend $1,000 instead of $100, he'd choose the $1,000 route every single time. In addition to getting his hands on his money, another big change came for Jakey when he turned 21. His mother divorced her second husband, which was the only father Jakey had ever known. She ditched him for Italian boxer Enzo Fiermonte, who was only a few years older than Jakey. And the young John Jacob didn't like this match at all, and he was very vocal about it. I have told that couple's story on this channel, and I have to say, I agree with Jakey 100% on this one. Enzo and his mother were not a good match. I won't go into all of the details here, but I'll say this. She was emotionally and financially abusive to him, and he was physically abusive to her. Now, as I was saying, Jakey didn't like this relationship with his mother and the boxer, and I completely understand why. But perhaps he could have navigated that situation more smoothly if he hadn't made his opinion known through snarky quotes to newspaper writers. He had to have known that that would embarrass his mother. The boxer, by the way, was the one who had made the comment about all of Jakey's luxury cars, saying that they were a bit overboard and basically suggesting that Jakey's obsession with them was unnatural. That's true, but that also could have come from a place of jealousy because the boxer himself had no problem at all spending his wife's money on expensive items for himself. But that was Madeleine's problem. That was her wedding. The young John Jacob would soon be making his own wedding plans. At the age of 21, he was officially available for marriage, and his fortune made him one of the most eligible bachelors in the world. But even with his massive fortune, and being a member of one of the most distinguished families in the country, the mothers and fathers of his society group were eager to pass on the chance of becoming his in-law and subjecting their debutantes to marriage with him. In 1934, he found a girl who was willing to take the challenge when New York socialite Eileen Gillespie said yes to his marriage proposal. The pair had been dating for a while and things seemed to be going well. They were planning a grand wedding. Everything was set, even the date, February 6, 1934. Then, Jakey started being Jakey. According to relatives of both families, Jakey was rude and sarcastic to Eileen's parents. Also, they were rather conservative and didn't approve of Jakey's flashy lifestyle and wild spending. Even though he was a grown man, he was said to have conducted himself like a petulant child. The Gillespies didn't approve of his, quote, fits of temperament, fickleness, jealousy, or his unstable and extravagant tastes, end quote. Then there was also the reported argument over the amount of Eileen's dowry. It seems that after the families had settled on an amount, Jakey wanted more. Eileen's parents had had enough. They tried to convince their daughter to move on from the Titanic baby. Here's a quote that Mrs. Gillespie gave to the Daily News in February of 1934. Quote, although her views and mine have been divided, at the present time we are absolutely in accord. I'm glad that I was able to open my daughter's eyes in time, end quote. And with that, the Lawrence Lewis Gillespies officially called off the wedding on January 22nd, just 2 weeks before their daughter was supposed to walk down the aisle. This cancellation surprised no one in high society except Jakey. He was so proud of his family name and fortune that it was inconceivable to him that debutantes weren't lining up at the chance to become the next Mrs. Astor by marriage to him. In the story about Jakey, the Daily News called The Rich Boy Nobody Wants, this was what they printed about young John Jacob's love for his money and family name. Quote, just how much money Jack has is probably known only to Jack, his closest relatives, bankers, and lawyers. But just how much family he has is known by a great many people in the world. And just how orally proud he is of that fortune and name is known by practically everyone in his social sphere. End quote. The people around Jakey were fed up with his bragging. All of the things that he bragged about having, they had. They were in his social circle. And they were all there for the same reason. Mainly that they all had ridiculous amounts of wealth. But Jakey thought that somehow his money made him more special. Perhaps it was this love of money and the status that he thought it gave him that made the young John Jacob resent his older brother, Vincent Astor, so much. And don't get it wrong, Vincent was no fan of Jakey. But while Jakey was bragging about having money, Vincent was busy making money for himself and his entire family. He kept to himself. Vincent married more than once, and neither he nor his wives enjoyed being in the public eye. He was a private person who liked to do good for his family and his city, out of the spotlight. He took his role as head of the Astor family and fortune very seriously. So when Jakey's mother asked him to take charge of Jakey's finances, he did, and he took that seriously too. Vincent seemed to put family ahead of everything. He was never a fan of Jakey's mother. Recall that when John Jacob Astor IV married her, she was only 18 and so was Vincent. But Vincent loved his father, so he accepted his father's wife. And while many reports say that Jakey's $3 million fortune grew to $5 million under Vincent's charge, several reports, like this one in the Daily News, say that Vincent actually increased his little brother's trust to somewhere around $10 million. But whether it was actually 5 or 10 million, it wasn't enough for John Jacob, and he wanted half of the money that was left to Vincent. The family knew how bitter he was, but the public and his elite social circle only saw the side of him that was constantly showing off, bragging, and spending like crazy. Because he never developed a personality, his hope was that material things would attract women to him. So, in an effort to prove himself as husband-worthy material for Eileen Gillespie, he purchased, quote, a colossal townhouse and an equally huge Newport place for the girl he hoped to make his bride, end quote. In the late 1800s, Newport, Rhode Island became the place where wealthy New Yorkers bought summer homes. That's why he purchased a place there too. But again, the huge homes would not be enough for the Gillespies to turn their daughter over into young Jacob's hands. Quick side note regarding the passing down of fortunes in the Astor family. This is one of the reasons that I love sharing these old news articles with you, because they give us a pretty unfiltered look at how people thought and talked back then, long before the days of political correctness, and I like that. So, the first John Jacob Astor had several daughters and 2 sons. They were John Jacob II and William Backhouse Astor. When the father died, he had a $20 million fortune, and he left most of it to William. John Jacob II was left only $10,000 because he was an idiot. Now, when they used the word idiot during his lifetime, they meant someone who had an intellectual disability. But I think that it's a little ironic that 3 generations later, the world sees another John Jacob give most of his money to the son who is not an idiot. And I mean idiot the way that we use that term today, like a fool or a moron. Anyway, this is how that long news story called The Rich Boy Nobody Wants ended. First, with a quote from a friend of the Gillespies, Mrs. Bruce Metcalf, and she was diplomatic about it. This is how the entire ending reads, quote, and Mrs. Bruce Metcalf, a friend of the Gillespies, is quoted as saying, I think the whole thing was a blessing. The young couple were not mated. They would never have been happy. How splendid that they found out in time. Now that's the end of her quote. Then it goes on to read, and the 5th John Jacob Astor is still the boy nobody wants. End quote. Now eventually, the young John Jacob did get married. And when somebody finally did want the boy, it was a bit of a scandal because she was a very close friend of Eileen Gillespie, his ex-fiancée. He settled on a girl named Ellen Tucky French. And this little hussy was so close to Eileen that she was going to be a bridesmaid in her wedding. Well, guess what? She had been attracted to little Jakey the whole time that Eileen was dating him. When he proposed to Eileen. When he was making wedding plans with Eileen. When he bought not 1, but 2 humongous houses for Eileen to share with her in holy matrimony. This friend stood by Eileen and helped her pick out wedding colors and wedding reception food and a wedding cake. She probably went with her to try on dresses and told Eileen that all the ugly dresses were actually pretty. But here's the thing. Jakey's heart was still with Eileen.
Nobody even thought that that little rascal had a heart, but he was heartbroken over losing Eileen. He left the country and went to Shanghai to grieve the relationship. Even months later, he said that he would still be willing to marry her. Now, we all know that he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. He still didn't really seem to understand that he was the one who had been dumped, so it didn't matter that he was still willing to marry her, but nevertheless, weeks after returning to New York, he proposed to Ellen French. Of course, she said yes, old nasty hussy, and you can't tell me that nasty Jakey got with Ellen for any other reason but to try to get under Eileen's skin. He would have married one of her friends regardless, because he was just that spiteful. But tell me this, do you think that part of Ellen's appeal to him was that her name was so close to Eileen? So, if he were to call out the wrong name in the throes of passion, he could just try to cover it up. But I must admit, this guy doesn't exactly give me the throes of passion, fun in the sack vibes. He seemed like he would want to hurry up and rush his time in bed so that he could go spend time with his one true love, his money. Anyway, Jakey and Ellen got married on June 30th, 1934. And don't they look happy? They had one child, a boy named William Backhouse Astor III. And I'm surprised that the Astors didn't retire the name Backhouse. So you know that Jakey and Vincent Astor are the grandchildren of Caroline Astor, the Gilded Age Queen of High Society. Well, she made her husband refer to himself as William B. Astor because she thought that Backhouse sounded too much like outhouse. So that was just a thought in my head. Young John Jacob went on to get married a total of 4 times in his life. And believe it or not, it wouldn't be the women in his life that proved to be the bane of his existence. Because you know how horrible wives can be, right, fellas? Ha ha ha. Just kidding, ladies. His biggest problem seemed to be wills that left him with scrawny inheritances. Not getting enough money when his closest family members passed away. First, there was his dad, who had the nerve to only leave him a measly $3 million after dying on the Titanic. Then, when his mother passed away, with about $1.5 million to her name, that money went to his younger half-brothers that she had with her second husband. His mom, at that point, figured that Jakey should have been good for money for the rest of his life. So all that she left him was a diamond solitaire ring and a 2-strand pearl necklace that wasn't worth a lot. I mean, if he were to have pawned that necklace, he wouldn't even have had enough money to buy one Rolls Royce. Sheesh. But then there was Vincent, his big brother. Jakey never let it go that Vincent got practically all of their father's money after he died. And even after Vincent died, he still pursued that $70 million that their father left to Vincent. And he got downright nasty about it. Now again, Vincent never liked young John Jacob. All that he did for him was because he was dutiful to his family. Vincent loved his father so much that he honored his father's wife. But truth be told, he never liked Madeleine. He never respected Madeleine, and therefore, when she gave birth to Jakey, Vincent didn't even believe that Jakey was a biological Astor, and he did not recognize him as such. But he still performed his duty as guardian over his brother's trust and grew the money. Jakey would never have as much money as Vincent, but Vincent saw to it that Jakey was set for life. And how did Jakey repay his brother? By suing Vincent's wife after Vincent died and trying to smear his brother's name posthumously. Here's the story. Vincent's health was failing him badly in 1958. He was hospitalized for a good part of that year. His wife, Brooke, would sometimes bring him alcohol, to help him deal with his pain. The alcohol didn't do much except provide him temporary pain relief, for his death was right around the corner. Vincent Astor passed away on February 3rd, 1959, at the age of 67. He died of a heart attack. But months before he passed, in June of 1958, he revised and signed a new will that left Jakey absolutely nothing. By this time, Vincent had grown his fortune to $120 million, and he left half of it to his wife for her living expenses so that she could maintain the luxurious lifestyle she had when Vincent was alive. The other half went to the charitable foundation that the couple managed, the Vincent Astor Foundation. And Jakey, never having been too smart in math, said, "Okay, his wife got half, his charity got half, now where's my half?" Okay, he didn't really say that, but he did come looking for the money that he always thought was his. Brooke hadn't even been able to get out of her mourning clothes before she found out that she was being sued by her dead husband's brother. That was bad enough, but what the young John Jacob told the press was even worse. Vincent Astor had always maintained a stellar reputation. Everyone saw him as an upright man. He was admired in high society circles, but he was the first Astor who was admired outside of those circles because he had a heart for the people in his city. He was the first Astor to take on philanthropic causes in any major way, and people remembered him that way. But Jakey told the press that his brother had left him out of his will because he was mentally ill, a senile alcoholic whose wife had been feeding him so much booze that when the time came for him to make his will, he was too insane to know what he was doing. He was trying to do to Vincent in death what he never could have done to him in life, attempt to ruin his image. Now, when Vincent's name appeared in the press, it was alongside words like mentally incompetent and deranged. Come on now, Jakey. Well before your brother got sick and was in his fully right state of mind, we all know that he was never a fan of yours and that the whole world would have expected Vincent to not acknowledge Jakey in his will. Brooke made it abundantly clear that Vincent was of sound mind and knew exactly what he was doing when he made his final will. And nobody was on Jakey's side, not even the press. Newsday hit him with a fat joke, writing, quote, "Vincent Astor, who died last February 3rd at the age of 67, left a fortune of between $100 million and $200 million, but not a cent of it to his portly younger half-brother." End quote. This portly prick was now 47 years old, jealous of his dead brother and still wanting money that never belonged to him. Instead of joining his sister-in-law to share in the grieving process, he'd made himself a burden on this heartbroken woman. But that was Jakey, always putting himself first and his love of money as a very close second. He whined that Vincent had a legal right, but not a moral right to keep all of the money. Well, once again, showing that he was not too bright, as he was suing in a court of law, not a court of morals. He accused Brooke of giving his brother alcohol to influence him to leave him out of the will. But anyone who knew even half of the story knew that on a sober day, Vincent would have made the same decision. He didn't need anything to influence him to tell his little brother to take a hike. Thankfully, the court did not agree with Jakey. Brooke Astor settled and gave her sorry-ass brother-in-law $250,000, probably just enough to really piss him off, and that was that. And she went on to give away those millions of dollars to charity and did so much good in the world because of it, just like she and her husband had always done. What a waste it would have been to have given that kind of money to a selfish person like Jakey. The Titanic baby died in Miami Beach in 1992. He was 79 years old. He was survived by his younger brother from his mom's second marriage, his daughter, son, and 3 grandchildren. One of them, Gregory Todd Astor, played Colonel Astor in Titanic the Musical in 2012, 100 years after the Titanic sank. Jakey's death was not remarked upon in any grand way, but that was probably the fairest reflection upon his life. He was not grand. He hadn't done anything but been born into wealth. Just months before Jakey died, his daughter, Jackie Astor, made a statement that might have humanized Jakey in some people's eyes. She said, quote, "It was all so sad and tragic for his mother and the whole family. You know, his parents were very much in love, and I think the memory of it all has affected his whole life. Why can't people just forget the Titanic?" End quote. Why can't we forget the Titanic? I know that for me, the answer is that ultimately, Titanic is a story about lives way more than the ship itself. I think of all of those people, and even their pets, being excited, nervous, looking forward to their next adventure that so many of them never got to see. I don't think that Titanic will ever be forgotten. So many people remember it for so many different reasons. The young John Jacob Astor wasn't the only child of a millionaire who was careless with his money. Eulalia Walker was the daughter of the woman who is widely known as America's first black millionaire, Madam C.J. Walker, who made her fortune in hair care with a product line and salons. She left a third of her estate to her daughter, and many would say that Eulalia squandered the money away. I published a video about that story that you can see here. I'll also leave a link to it in the description box.
My sources for this story are National Archives UK, the Pensacola News Journal Archives 1909, the Buffalo Inquirer Archives 1909, the Daily Northwestern Archives 1909, Brooklyn Life Archives 1910, the Lincoln Star Archives 1912, the Spokane Press Archives 1912, the Evening World Archives 1912, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle Archives 1912, and the New York Tribune Archives 1916, Garrett Clipper Archives 1933, Shadow of the Titanic by Andrew Wilson, the Minneapolis Star Archives 1933, Express.co.uk, the Brooklyn Citizen Archives 1933, Princeton Daily Clarion Archives 1933, the Cameron Sun Archives 1933, Brooklyn Daily Eagle Archives 1933, 1934, 1937, and 1938, Democrat and Chronicle Archives 1939, Lancaster New Era Archives 1939, Daily News Archives 1933, 1934, 1935, 1938, and 1939, the Buffalo News Archives 1934 and 1935, and the Star Gazette Archives 1935.
The Buffalo Courier Archives 1912, Shadow of the Titanic by Andrew Wilson, the Buffalo Inquirer Archives 1912 and 1916, the Detroit Free Press Archives 1992, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle Archives 1912, 1934, and 1940, the Buffalo Times Archives 1913, Newsday Suffolk Archives 1959, and the Boston Globe Archives 1932. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the hot mess history. The link is in the description box.
If you have a business, YouTube channel, or social media platform that you would like to promote to the Hot Mess History Messtorians, email us at taiwan@tysaidwhattysaid.com. We'll come up with a campaign that gives you visibility and fits your budget.